Hello everybody, and welcome to the first video in our section on recipe costing. In this video today we're going to be talking about the overall costing sheet to start with, and then how do we turn the invoice price, or the price we pay our supplier for ingredients, into a price that we can use in our recipe. From our supplier, we're buying things by the case, and obviously most recipes we're not using those ingredients by the case. So how do we turn those into usable prices? So the first thing is, the goal of a costing sheet is to determine the total recipe cost and the cost proportion, right? We're going to determine what it costs to make that entire mushroom soup recipe, and then we're going to determine what it costs for 1 cup of mushroom soup. To do this, you're going to have obviously the recipe with all the ingredients and their quantities, and it needs to be an accurate recipe. It can't be, 4 handfuls of mushrooms, or, it should be accurate weight measurements wherever possible. Flour should not be in cups, it should be in grams, things of that nature, right? You're going to need the yield percentage for each ingredient as it is to be prepared, right? So if you're using carrots in your recipe, don't use your yield percentage for turning carrots. Use your yield percentage for whatever you're doing in the recipe, like dicing or julienne or whatnot, right? You're going to need the AP dollar for each ingredient, and this is going to be in 2 formats. We're going to get the invoice AP dollars, and then we're going to convert that into a usable AP dollars in our recipe, which I'll show you in a minute. We're going to need the EP dollars for any item that requires a butcher's yield test. So for example, the turkey that we used in the previous videos, we figured out what the cost was for the cooked, trimmed, saleable weight of the turkey breast that we could use in our clubhouse. We're going to take that price and we'll put that in as our EP dollars for cooked turkey breast. On the costing sheet itself, it's going to have the following things. It's going to have the recipe's name, obviously. It's going to have the number of portions or yield in the recipe, and hopefully it's going to tell us how big those portions are, right? If it's a cup of soup from our mushroom soup, I want to know if that portion is 120 milliliters or 200 milliliters. Our cost proportion, which we will calculate, spice factor and Q factor, you don't have to worry about those now. They'll be coming up in subsequent videos. Our food cost and our selling price, again, we're going to show you how to calculate that in later videos. So let's have a look at a sample here. So right off the top, we have the name of the recipe. It's couscous with carrots and raisins. We have a spice factor. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about that later. Portions, 8. That's great, but I would love to know how big those portions are. We're going to have a spot for our cost proportion, our food cost percent, our Q factor, and what our selling price is. All the things we're going to calculate in subsequent videos. The important thing to notice here is we have 2 columns with AP dollars in it. The first column that has the AP dollars has $4.20 per quart for the price of the couscous. That's what it costs us from our supplier. If we went to Safeway or Walmart and bought couscous, it costs us $4.20 per quart. But we're not using quarts in our recipe, we're using cups. So this next column here, the AP dollars converted, is for us to convert this price of AP dollars of what our invoice price was into a price that applies to what we're using in our recipe. We need a price per cup, right? We can't apply the price to quarts if we're using 2 cups. The same thing goes for the carrots. It's a price per pound, but we're using ounces, so we need to convert it into a price per ounce. Raisins, same thing. Notice down here under the yield percentage for chopped parsley, it has 1 bun is equal to 8 tablespoons. Now that bun isn't a cocktail bun. That is short for a bunch. So 1 bunch of parsley is going to give us on average 8 tablespoons of parsley. So for the costing sheet, the units in the price per unit must match in the ingredients list for our costing price. And like I said already, we normally don't buy stuff in the same size that we're using in our recipe. We're going to buy a case of tomatoes, but we're not using a case of tomatoes in our clubhouse sandwich, right? We're going to need a price per tomato or per gram or something like that. So when we buy products from our suppliers, our invoices are often like list prices, which can be broken down to a number of units per case. For example, you have a case of canned tomatoes, you're going to have 6 cans in that case, and each can is 100 ounces or 2.84 liters, depending on on what's written on the invoice or on the case, right? So the first example here, we've got a 12/1 quart. What that means is, in the case that you bought for however many dollars, there were 12 1-quart containers in that case. So maybe it was a case of cream. So we had 12 quarts of cream in that case, but there were 12 individual cartons that were 1 quart each. 40 pounds, well, whatever that case or bag was, it was 40 pounds. The 8/5 pounds, that means there are 8 containers, boxes, bags, whatever, and each one of those bags is 5 pounds. So there's actually 40 pounds in that whole case. There's 8 containers, each holding 5 pounds. The next one, 6 number 10 cans, that means that there are 6 cans in the case, and those cans, that's a sizing. That's a number 10 can. Those are those large cans that you've seen at school. They're usually 100 ounces or 2.84 liters, right? And then obviously 80 count. So however big the bag or the box is, there's 80 pieces in that bag, right? Recognize that slash in there means that you have 8 5 pounds, or you have 12 1 quarts, right? That's how we delineate how many individual packages are in a case, right? So how do we make these things usable in our recipe? Well, it comes down to using our conversions that we've learned in the previous videos, right? How do we convert quarts into cups? We need to know how many cups are in a quart, right? So the first thing you can do is you can calculate the total weight or volume of that case. So for instance, the 12/1 quarts, we know that there are 12 quarts in that case, right? There are 12 individual containers, but as a whole in that case, there were 12 quarts. And obviously for volume, you just substitute volume, which I was just using with the quarts, right? Then you can divide by your conversion number, right? To get to whatever, if it's quarts to cups, how many cups are in a quart, right? So let me show you an example. So diced tomato costs $16.54 for a case of 6 number 10 cans. A kitchen test shows that 1 number 10 can contains 6 pounds, 6 ounces of products. So what's our cost per ounce? So the first thing I want to do is I want to turn this 6 pounds, 2 ounces into a whole number. So 6 times 16 plus 6 is going to give me 102 ounces, right? So 1 number 10 can is 110 ounces, 1 number 10 can. But we have 6 cans, right, in that case. So we can figure out the total weight of the case by multiplying 6 times 102 ounces, which will give us 612 ounces in our case. So once we have that, we know that we have $16.54 is what our case cost, and that equals 612 ounces. Well, we can divide by 612, divide by 612, and we can get a price for 1 ounce, right? And that would give me 0.027 cents dollars per ounce, right? So now this, we would assume this ounce is what we're using in the recipe, right? We're not using a whole case of diced tomato in our recipe, so we're converting this case price into a price per ounce. So I got another example here. So vinegar costs $31.80 for 4 1-gallon jugs, right? So that 4/1 means that we have 4 jugs in our case, and each jug is 1 gallon. And we want to get to a price per cup. So we know from our magic box that 1 gallon equals 16 cups, right? So if we have 4 gallons in our case, we can go 4 times 16 will give us our number of cups, which is 64 cups, right? Okay, so if we know that we have 64 cups in the case, and it's $31.80, which equals 64 cups, and we're looking for a price per cup, well, to get to 1, we divide by 1, that's going to give us 1 cup. So 31.80 divided by 16, or divided by 64, excuse me, divided by 64 gives us 0.497 for 1 cup. So like our couscous in our example recipe, where we had a price per quart, we could convert that into a price per cup, very similar to this, right? So some possible complications that you can come across. The weight listed on the can is not the same as the product's drained weight. Something like this is like a jar of pickles or a jar of capers, where, you know, it says 4 liters of pickles. Well, there aren't 4 liters of pickles. There's 4 liters of pickles and brine, but we're not using that brine. So the way to figure out what our yield is, we're going to actually have to empty that container out and weigh the pickles and figure out what our weight yield was, right? So then we don't have a yield percentage, we have the actual yield. We can figure out exactly what our price is. So we call it a kitchen test, right? Another issue we could have is the container measures contents in weight, but the recipe measures in volume, or vice versa, right? So if you have a recipe that's calling for 4 cups of flour, but your price is you're paying for it by the kilo, you need to convert, and that's by using a conversion or by actually weighing it in the kitchen, right? To figure out how much a cup of flour weighs. I would take a few averages, right? Because every time you scoop flour, you might scoop it a little harder or scoop it a little lighter to come up with an average weight, right? So, like I said, in both cases, we've taken care of the yield percentage by actually calculating the physical yield that came out of those jars or out of the flour conversion, right? So yield becomes 100% on our costing sheet. All right, so that's our first video on converting units, and please move on to the next one.